I find myself appreciating some slower, quieter movies and TV lately. I've come across some new and old that in terms of pacing are unlike anything I'd seen before, and I found them really refreshing and interesting, in part because of that strikingly unusual pace. I don't just mean, though, thoughtful, long, stylish dramas like a Terrence Malick or a Denis Villeneuve or a Paul Thomas Anderson. I also don't mean a stylish, dreamy, fluid movie like a Wong Kar-wai or Barry Jenkins. I like all those directors, but I mean really slow movies. I've been watching lately, like Tsai Ming-liang's Goodbye Dragon Inn, where we have a 10-minute scene just observing an audience, not doing much in a cinema. Or something like Nicolas Winding Refn's Only God Forgives, where Ryan Gosling's Julian just looks at his hands for long stretches. These aren't perfect movies. Only God Forgives in particular is far from perfect, but there's something fascinating to me about them, about that pace. I'm really interested in a few questions that I thought I'd explore in this video. Firstly, why are films like this, films that are this slow, not boring? And how does this slow pace change the way we engage with what we're watching? Do we begin to watch a slow movie differently? So I thought I'd make this video to work through those questions and as an excuse to recommend some unusual, probably not widely seen slow movies and TV that I've loved recently. Historically, this sort of cinema probably began in the 1950s and 60s with Italian neorealist cinema. This movement included some great, pretty slow movies like Vittorio De Sica's Bicycle Thieves, Antonioni's L'Avventura, Visconti's Rocco and His Brothers. Then there were some even slower, even greater, in my opinion, movies made in the 60s and 70s by the Russian director Andrei Tarkovsky, Solaris, Stalker, and the American director Stanley Kubrick, Barry Lyndon, 2001 A Space Odyssey. Then in the 90s, there have been some great slow movies coming out of China, like Jia Zhangke's A Touch of Sin, and some out of Taiwan, like Tsai Ming-liang's Goodbye Dragon Inn, and some out of America, like Gus Van Sant's Death Trilogy, Gerry, Elephant, Last Days. More recently, I loved Kenneth Lonergan's Manchester by the Sea, and I've loved really all of Nicolas Winding Refn's movies and his TV series. And even more recently, I really liked this British series by Shane Meadows and Jack Thorne called The Virtues, which I think, in moments anyway, is another example of slow cinema. And to talk quickly about exactly what I mean by slow cinema, it's hard to define exactly, and I'll talk about why I think some meet the criteria and some don't. But really the main thing that characterizes slow cinema, I think, is long shots, often quiet, often with little happening in terms of action or plot per minute or per 10 minutes compared to the average film or compared to most mainstream films. So, for example, Goodbye Dragon Inn is composed of 86 shots over its 82 minutes. So the average shot length then is 57.2 seconds. And there aren't many lines of dialogue in the whole film. Most characters are almost mute. There's also little kind of movement in terms of the action in the frame. It's quiet in all respects. As a contrast, Wes Anderson's The Grand Budapest Hotel has an average shot length of 5.4 seconds. Michael Bay, across his whole filmography, has an average shot length of 3 seconds. Christopher Nolan, 3.1. Spielberg, 6.5. So again, Goodbye Dragon Inn, with an average shot length of 57 seconds, is strikingly different from so much of what we're used to in terms of pace. I think the main thing I'm interested in is how a really slow movie or TV show changes the way we, as spectators, engage with it. I feel like I slow down in response to the slowness of the scene I'm watching. I begin to not expect cuts or action, so I stop looking for them. Instead, I look differently, kind of all around the frame, like I might look at a painting or a photograph. I become less concerned about plot, dialogue, and even character, and much more aware of the environment, the space in the shot, and the feel of things. Everything feels more private, less like a show, but more like a slice of life I've happened upon, as if I've happened upon an always recording security camera or something. A lot of these movies are not just slow, but as I say, quiet too. So image, atmosphere, gesture, and feelings seem to be emphasized, whereas language and plot and action are de-emphasized. So in these ways, they often work more like silent films. The language of these movies is quiet, gentle, suggestive, or often symbolic. For example, in the movies of Tsai Ming-liang, whose films might strike you as having very little going on, I find myself noticing all sorts of small, quiet things happening in each scene. If Tsai Ming-liang shows me a public bathroom, say, for long enough, I begin to see it in new ways. I become aware of not just what I'm looking at, but the way I'm looking. I can't help, when we're talking about, public bathrooms as art, I can't help but also think of the most famous toilet in art, that Marcel Duchamp fountain, a urinal simply placed upside down, signed in an art gallery. Like slow cinema, fountain prompts the question, what is art? Does this count as art, just a found object? Is simply observing the familiar art, if it's in an artistic context? Well, they're all difficult questions, but I think if it stirs us to grapple with these sorts of questions, interesting questions to me, and to think differently about how we observe things, why we observe things, then it is at least achieving something of value and of interest. Tsai Ming-liang manages to use this patient, curious perspective to peer into public, familiar spaces and occurrences and make them feel private, special, or new. He achieves this partly by touching on that juxtaposition of private and public inherent in some of these spaces. For example, an apartment building, like the one in his 1998 film The Hole, is a large space shared by strangers, so it's kind of public in that sense. But when the walls and floors begin to collapse under the pressure of a citywide pandemic and under the weight of nature, falling rain, water seeping into the building's very foundation, that privacy and separation also breaks down. Neighbours peer into each other's private spaces through holes in the floor. They become conscious of sharing the same water, as a neighbour flushing his toilet means the kitchen tap stops running in someone else's room. Public bathrooms, as we've said in Goodbye Dragon Inn, and What Time Is It There, also allow Tsai to explore this intersection of public and private in interesting and sometimes very funny ways. The cinema goer's experience, too, is captured and revealed to contain similar contradictions. The spectators in Goodbye Dragon Inn are strangers, some not even sharing a language, and yet they all are engaged in a shared kind of personal experience, the dreamlike experience of watching a movie in the dark, sometimes shoulder to shoulder together. The American screenwriter and director Paul Schrader discusses slow cinema when he talks about the idea of transcendental style in film. Schrader argues that when a film refuses to cut, like we're discussing, and holds on emptiness or boredom, it's asking us to lean into the film, to engage more actively, more creatively ourselves as spectators than we usually do. In terms of when this becomes effective rather than just boring, Schrader seems to think it's a matter of balance, a balance between that requesting of extra engagement with slowness and also then rewarding it with something surprising by changing that up as well. He gives the example of Polakowski's Ida being slow, quiet, and composed of stationary shots for a time, and then bursting with energy with a tracking shot near the end. In Goodbye Dragon Inn, that moment is even more obvious, I think. For the first 29 minutes, we have mainly shots of 1 to 3 minutes in length, observing the audience and the staff of this theatre on its closing night, screening this old Taiwanese actioner. As we watch the staff of the theatre, including a woman with impaired mobility, laboriously moving around the theatre, eventually making her way to the screen, and mainly hearing, not seeing, the action of the film that's being screened there. Then, all of a sudden, the woman looks up to the screen, as I say, 29 minutes in, from kind of in or behind the screen. We're given a series of 1 to 3 second cuts as she watches the movie's heroine in a high-octane action sequence. That's the highlight of the film, one of the highlights of my movie-watching experience of the last few years, and it's perhaps that moment that Schrader's talking about, where we're rewarded after a long stretch of one slow pace with a surprising shake-up. Film scholar Kristen Thompson talks about an idea that I think is also relevant to what happens when we watch slow cinema. She talks about neo-formalism, the central idea of which is defamiliarization. She argues that the essential role of art is to surprise us and to shake up our habits of perception, so we experience things in a fresh way. So then one of the main aims of cinema might be to raise our awareness of the complexity and intensity of perception itself. Using this framework, we might suggest that Tsai's films are not so much important just for any new points they make about loneliness or human relationships, etc., but for the way they challenge us to dissolve and reform our own ideas and beliefs about these things. For me, Tsai's calm, patient camera holding on a barely moving image for long stretches does achieve this, a change in my perspective. I find my focus turns away from the plot, from expectation of action, and back on myself, making me think about how and why I watch a scene. I even start to think about what parts of the frame my eye is drawn to and why, and how my own internal tracking of time affects what I see and what I feel about a scene. This experience is perhaps what people feel more often with fine art, when we're forced to have a more self-reflective internal experience, because the external, the art object, is static, like a statue. Our engagement with it is kind of on us, so we're more aware of the way we engage, the way we look. All of Nicolas Refn's work is also pretty slow, but does it work in the same way we've been discussing? Is it so slow and at times formless that our attention turns back on itself in this good way? I'd say a lot of Refn's movies have too much going on to function this way, as that kind of pure slow cinema. Drive, for example, has a strong, propulsive narrative. Bronson has so many ideas and such an engaging, energetic character at its core. Valhalla Rising has a real sense of momentum with its strong action and plot. We never reach that point of meditative spectatorship that, say, Tsai Ming-liang's films do. However, in some episodes, I think of his TV series, Too Old to Die Young, and perhaps in Only God Forgives, it does feel like slow cinema to me. In the opening scenes of Too Old to Die Young, the camera pans so slowly for so long, and not for the sake of plot, but just to bathe in the aesthetics of the cinematography, I think, mainly, and just to feel that mood and that slowness. That's more like what we're talking about. The opening shot is, in fact, in Too Old to Die Young, is in fact of still art. It's a large mural, and we're then invited to watch patiently a scene late at night, characters' faces and cars gently lit by neon lights. In Only God Forgives, Gosling's Julian stares, as we mentioned before, as quietly and calmly as we do at the doomed world around him and his place in it. Like his character in Drive too, he's near mute, communicating with a slow glance and expressing kind of all of his hopes and fears, whatever it is he's thinking, by staring into his own hands. I think for me, the first example of slow cinema I remember ever seeing, or at least that I made it to the end of, was Gus Van Sant's Gerry. One of his trilogy of death, along with Elephant, which was a gloomy, dreamy exploration of a Columbine-like school shooting.
This is not going to do it. These long pants. Everybody else is wearing shorts. What's the matter?
I don't want to talk about.
And Last Days, which spans the final days of a Kurt Cobain. Really. Elephant, I think, is the best of the three, but Gerry is perhaps the best example of slow cinema. Last Days is similarly slow, probably, but less effective. Gerry achieved, for me, some of that transcendence that Tsai Ming-liang consistently does, or more consistently does. Two men in Gerry, both named Gerry, become lost on a hike. They're played by Matt Damon and Casey Affleck. And so too does the film become kind of lost. It wanders bleakly, quietly through this outback. As their hearts and feet beat along, heads bobbing, the movie achieves a meditative rhythm. There are some I've seen recently that I really liked and were really slow, but are, I think, a bit different from the pure slow cinema we've been discussing, in that they are less experimental and more narratively conventional. Movies like Kenneth Lonergan's Manchester by the Sea and Who Bows and Elephant Sitting Still are slow, but they're kind of conventional stories slowed down and stretched out. The mind slows and perception is altered, I think, but there is a pretty consistent forward momentum through that narrative. Kubrick is perhaps similar. He has long, slow scenes, but also such great, engaging plots, worlds, characters, and ideas that we never truly give in to that slow pace, distracted as we are by the other elements. The Kubrick that comes closest, though, I think, is Barry Lyndon, where we do have scenes that feel completely free from plot, and are interested instead in just quietly observing an image, a person, a scene, or a landscape. Barry Lyndon was also apparently very influenced by 18th century English paintings, and it often feels like we're looking at a painting rather than a movie. Kubrick was thought to have used as inspiration for those shots landscapes and portraits by painters like William Hogarth, Thomas Gainsborough, Joshua Reynolds. Krzysztof Kieslowski, like Kubrick, is one of my very favourite directors, and he's also an example of a director willing to be slow at times, but whose films are not defined by it, not defined by that slowness. I have a great version of the Three Colours trilogy. It's a Criterion Collection package in which there are lots of special features, making of documentary, interviews, behind the scenes, etc. In one of these, Kieslowski discusses the process of deciding how long to hold on a particular shot. It's this shot of coffee or tea being absorbed into a sugar cube. It's in, I think, blue, maybe red. And he talks about, figuring out at what point audiences will become bored. And he decides it's only a matter of seconds before he had to cut, but he wanted to hold as long as possible. His films are very serious and at times pretty slow, but this perhaps demonstrates why I don't put him in this same category. He's conscious of not letting his audience get bored, even if there are slow moments. I think the pace of his films are informed by and reflect the ideas that come first. So idea, plot, character are primary. Pace is secondary and supports that for him. Whereas I think in Tsai Ming-liang, for example, it's the other way around. He's not so concerned with plot. Kieslowski is not interested in slowing down for the sake of experiencing that slowness, as his commentary about the sugar cube shot suggests. He is willing to slow down, though, to depict something realistically or rigorously, like a devastating grief that takes time. But this is not the same as Liang's or Refn's desire to just sit with an image or a character to feel the full weight of time and isolation. Now, this next director, like a lot of them, I don't quite know how to pronounce the name. Nuri Bilge Ceylan, perhaps. His movies are also examples of slow cinema, I think. I've only seen 2 of his movies, both of which I liked a lot. Once Upon a Time in Anatolia and Winter Sleep. I saw Winter Sleep first, and I think that's generally considered the stronger, but I think I preferred Once Upon a Time in Anatolia. A long movie following a group of people connected to, mainly by their involvement in investigating, an apparent murder. A doctor, a police officer, a prosecutor, the accused drive across these great Turkish landscapes to find the location of the victim. That's kind of the first long act. The film then shifts in its second half to focus mainly on the doctor and becomes more an exploration of personal moral responsibility, regret, uncertainty. It becomes a bit Dostoevskian in its exploration of guilt, morality. I watched a British series recently called The Virtues, which reminded me a lot of Manchester by the Sea in terms of plot and ideas, but also in terms of this slow pace. It's not quite as slow as some of these others we've discussed, but its pace is very deliberate and noticeable. Each episode in the 4-part miniseries contains only a relatively small number of scenes, these long, focused scenes. For example, an early demonstration of the protagonist's alcoholism involves a long sequence of him in a bar. There are plenty of cuts, but the way The Virtues commits to a scene, its camera following doggedly the character of interest and showing the experience it's interested in to its final point, is effective and unusual in TV. Like the others we've discussed, it also involves reaching a point where you stop expecting a new scene and instead just kind of settle into the moment and consider what it is and why you're being shown it for so long or why you're choosing to sit with it for so long. The experience of watching The Virtues, and I think Manchester by the Sea, is a bit like descending one of those outdoor concrete flights of steps where each step is just a bit too long to get a comfortable cadence going. Those two shows have this really deliberate, slow but confident pace, stepping us down to some buried or trauma or truth we suspect is coming at the bottom. And at each step you really feel the weight of the landing and the importance of where you are. Like we said about Too Old to Die Young, I think Lynch's Twin Peaks: The Return does have an overarching plot. I mean, it definitely does. And it contains episodes that are thrilling, propulsive, and not what we've been talking about at all in this video. But Twin Peaks The Return also has a few episodes that I think do meet the criteria of slow cinema. The famous episode 8 and a lot of episodes 1 and 2 and the finale include kind of strikingly quiet, detached scenes. Moments that feel detached in that they're not they're not engaged with the plot. They're like breaks from the usual momentum, where we just sit with the scene rather than expect or interpret any new events. For example, Dougie waiting in a waiting room, staring at a PowerPoint. Cooper and Carrie Page driving through the night from Odessa, Texas, back to Twin Peaks. Another recent example, and another example starring Casey Affleck, is David Lowery's A Ghost Story, which is an exploration of grief and the passing of time. It is very much about time, really, I think, this movie. The way the echoes of the past ring out through the future and ring differently. Sometimes fainter, sometimes stronger. The way memory and grief, similarly, change and fade through time, but never quite die. It's a fascinating film, I think, and it also considers the impact of time in a few of its particularly quiet, long scenes. The best known and best example is that pie-eating scene where Affleck's character, now a ghost, watches his girlfriend, played by Rooney Mara, eat a pie, as do we watch her for 8 minutes with just 2 shots. Another director whose name I don't really know how to pronounce, Jia Zhangke. I've only seen 2 of his movies. A Touch of Sin was great, and Ash's Purest White was really good too. Both were quiet, slow films with bursts of violence, often then followed by more thoughtful, quiet, slow reflections on the consequences of crime. All right, to wrap up, here's my personal ranking of the movies that I've mentioned in this video, at least the ones that I like enough to recommend. I really like them all, so it's hard to rank. Some are not so clearly examples, though, as we've discussed, of the specific kind of slow cinema that we're talking about, but I'll include them here nonetheless, as I'll take any excuse to recommend these movies, but I'll separate them out from very slow cinema, which is that pure transcendent cinema we're talking about, and just slow cinema. I'm also planning to make a video about some of these films specifically, like just diving into some analysis for Goodbye Dragon Inn and Manchester by the Sea. If anyone's interested in checking those out, remember to subscribe. Click the button down the bottom so that you'll get a notification when that comes out, whenever it does. And if you're interested in me diving into any of these other films, or if you've got any other examples of great cinema, I'm sure there are a lot I don't know about. I'm not an expert on this stuff. I've just started watching these lately. Please let me know in the comments if you've got someone you think I've missed, a director I've missed, or a great example I haven't touched on. I know there are some names like Abbas Kiarostami, Roy Andersson, Pedro Costa, Claire Denis, who are meant to be great directors, some of whom work in this kind of slow cinema style, and I've seen none of any of those, which I plan to do as soon as possible. But yeah, if anyone's got any recommendations or thinks one of those in particular is worth starting with, let me know in the comments.